here's how a vaccine's developed in real terms, and here's how doggone hard it is to get the dang thing right.
Some people have to have a conclusion that fails for them to realize that their conclusion was wrong.
Scientists need to take a much more active role in the public discourse as scientists. We need a scientific TikTok. I mean, the Chinese at least got that right about their social media laws in China.
Each of us here has gone through scientific training. I'd say each of us, to at least an extent, believes in the scientific method and believes that society in general can benefit from the pursuit of truth. Is that accurate? Just saying like as a group?
Of course.
Yes.
Okay. So what can be done now to start to move things forward? So how can we start to, redevelop a trust in the scientific method? How can we, those 4 points, one, the readers of the science misrepresenting. How can the lay public be able to read scientific papers without misunderstanding or misrepresenting their findings? How can scientists write better stuff? How can the media be less sensationalized? And how can leadership be more transparent with decision-making and checkpoints?
That is a massive question. We could go a lot of different ways with this. I think the core issue though falls to scientific communication. And when I say that, I'm not talking about journals, publications, conferences. I'm talking about our communication with lay audiences, because our political leaders actually fall in, for the most part, into that lay audience. Scientists need to take a much more active role in the public discourse as scientists. They need to do their absolute best to not wear a red or a blue jersey when they appear in the public discourse, but they need to actually make a better effort to do that. There are some individuals who are already doing a pretty good job at this, in my estimation. So for example, there's Pete Judo on YouTube. He's actually doing a lot, in my opinion, to try and take scientific issues and talk about them and try and make them at least a little bit more understandable for a lay individual. So he tends to focus on scientific reporting, and for better or for worse, he's focused more on the publication crisis and talking about scientists who a little corrupt, but at least in the process of doing that, he's giving actually a very good masterclass in how to review the scientific literature, how to evaluate scientific knowledge. And we need more people doing that. We need them doing it in a very public manner. I mean, I hate to say it, there used to be, and there still kind of is, a scientific Twitter. We need a scientific TikTok. I mean, the Chinese at least got that right about their social media laws in China. We really should be focusing on developing on putting out social media that is educating for the lay public, and interesting to the lay public, so we can begin to teach them about how to actually approach scientific issues. So next time
within that, so I think it's fair to say, within my experience, I don't know what anyone else's experience is like, but within my experience, the people doing the basic research are often not the best communicators. They don't necessarily write particularly well. Oftentimes, English isn't their native language. They struggle with communication, written and verbal. But you're saying we need a class of individuals sitting between the basic science and the public. But that group would have to have scientific training and evaluation ability to be able to adequately do that. So I think right now, the media is probably stepping in that role. But they are, in many ways, a lay audience when it comes to technical material. So we need to have a whole class of individuals who are incentivized somehow to provide that kind of intercessory space between basic science and public ingestion.
Yeah,
that's
exactly what I'm saying. We need individuals who have high quality scientific training, understand how things work, understand what it takes to get a grant, understand what it takes to have a scientific experiment, and analyze the data and publish it, and with enough domain knowledge to then take that and make it something that's digestible for our lay audiences, whether that lay audience being, our friends and family or our political leaders.
So
and they need
other than purely, altruistic reasoning, why would a scientist do that? Someone with that level of training?
Well, I mean, it all comes down to money, right? If you,
There's no
someone's
money
not
there.
going to. No, there's really not that much unless you make a really successful YouTube channel. And let me tell you, from what I've seen, academic YouTube is not that lucrative. You're going to make some, but you're not. I mean, it's not going to be a ton. But that's what needs to happen. We need to find a way to create that job, for lack of a better term. That it needs to exist. In some ways, I mean, that's what magazines like Popular Science were for our parents, at least, or other magazines like Scientific American used to be. They used to be a way to take scientific research that was cutting edge and put it into a format that most people could understand or at least begin to approach. And those magazines have I mean, when was the last time you saw a copy of one of those and it wasn't in a magazine stand in the airport?
I remember was the last time I saw a magazine.
Right.
That
exactly.
wasn't a stand at the airport.
Right. So that media is just forgotten. No one's buying it anymore. And so they're struggling to try and figure out how to move forward. But losing that media and especially that media losing its place on our coffee tables, I think has had an impact. I mean, my parents used to, my dad for years had a subscription to Scientific American, Popular Mechanics, or Popular Science. I can't remember which one. It was one of those. They're almost interchangeable in my mind. And then National Geographic. Nobody has those anymore. The only one of those that I ever see on a regular basis is National Geographic. That's because Disney Plus bought them. And every time I turn on one of those documentaries, my children complain. So I'd only get about 5 minutes of them at a time. So we need something to fill that niche again. We're kind of going through we're going through a patch where economically there's no wind in the sails of those ships. And so people are trying to figure out if they're in the right ship or not. And nothing's getting produced, at least not in a way that everybody's seeing it and interested in it like they are in TikTok dances.
Ryan, you look like you got a million ideas zinging around in your head right now.
Yeah, I don't know if I was a little surprised to hear TikTok be brought up, to be honest. That was an interesting take. Fascinating.
Just hashtag that in the video description.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, unfortunately, science isn't cool anymore. It's snooty. That's what it's perceived as, at least in my view. And I think scientists need to trust that individuals are smart and not talk down. I don't know. I see that a lot. I see that in the media, at least, when they're talking about science and whatever, pretending like everyone's just a science denier and throwing that out there. What we should all be focusing on is not trying to convince each other based on what letters are next to someone's name, right? Instead, trying to convince each other based on evidence. And some people are going to come to wrong conclusions, but just like the scientific method, some people have to have a conclusion that fails for them to realize that their conclusion was wrong. And so if we just continually attempt to convince each other with good evidence, I think over time that can hopefully start to correct itself. So if there's another pandemic, maybe things will go a little bit smoother,
Yeah. If I were trying to fill this niche right now, I wouldn't talk about current science. I would go back and I would look at scientific history. So I would go, for example, if COVID were to happen all over again,
worked out pretty well for him.
Yeah, let's talk about him. No, but if let's say it's 2019 and I have this. Somehow I know that COVID's going to happen. I've got inside information from Wuhan or something. I don't know. If I were trying to educate the American public in a way that would prepare them for what's coming, I would want to sit down and talk about Dr. Salk and developing the polio vaccine and talk about that entire process that took years. How bad polio was, how it afflicted the world health, and how important it was to develop that vaccine and the process of developing the vaccine, because then that would give them an idea of like, here's how a vaccine's developed in real terms, and here's how doggone hard it is to get the dang thing right. And here are all the effects that we saw during the development of that first successful vaccine. We could do the same thing with talking about, like, you could also do the same thing with talking about the influenza pandemic post World War I. Here is how a respiratory virus goes from a local problem to a worldwide problem, and here's everything that we did as a species at a time to try and mitigate and control this virus so it doesn't kill as many people as it potentially could. And here's how confusing it was for political leadership. Here's how confusing it was at the level of the community and the level of the family. So when COVID actually happened, we have a frame of reference to understand what happened in the past, not just that something happened, but what actually happened and what did people do and what were the downstream effects of that in really real terms, so they could have a little bit more context for everything that happened during COVID. Well, and maybe that would give everybody, political leaders and lay individuals, enough grace to understand what's actually going on behind closed doors and behind the curtains.
Yeah, fine. I was actually going to say pretty much the same thing. That I think what I would add would be that it's imperative for us to give grace. I think that we need to begin to have the confidence in each other that people are doing their best. And part of the process of science is making mistakes, and that's okay. Right. Because I saw leaders at the organization that I worked for during the pandemic being crippled because they were so afraid of being wrong that they did nothing, which led to probably worse outcomes than otherwise would have happened. And I think the lack of doing something is in and of itself a choice. And you're making a choice to do nothing, which probably is the wrong choice in some cases. Not always, but not being able to do something is still a choice. And I think leaders and, lay people should all feel empowered to make the choice they believe is best based on the evidence they have at the time. And we need to give each other the grace to know that's going to be wrong sometimes. And that's okay. Obviously there's problems, like if there are leaders in place who are operating not for the best interest, according to their respective office, that's an issue in and of itself. Probably a separate issue that's much more that's outside the scope of our conversation here, realistically. But
we can have that conversation next time.
Yes, next time. But realistically, we need to have people in those positions who feel empowered to do what's right, and give them the grace to know that they're trying. And I think it's up to them to be transparent and be able to have those plans to say, we're going with this course of action. We will evaluate at this time. And these are the methods we'll use to evaluate.
I think that sort of messaging appropriately delivered by the media, and the media being, of course, legacy media and new media, like podcasts and videos and all that stuff, if that had been appropriately transmitted to the American public and the American public had been listening and understood what was going on, I think the pandemic would be viewed in completely different terms and would not have been the political catalyst that it's become today. But unfortunately, that's not how things played out. I don't think we weren't ready for that. No one was thinking about that at the time. A lot of us just kind of felt like deer in the headlights a little bit, and we're just trying to react and not get run over.
I suspect that these problems with science existed before, and that the trust in science had been degrading to the point over time that when there was a critical need for science to aid in decision-making, the trust wasn't there and the mechanisms weren't there. And so science became so divisive, became almost just kind of the scientific method was almost abused in favor of various agendas. And I think because the lack of understanding of how it should actually work, and no one trusts it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, there is a history, prior to the pandemic, there is a history of some distrust in science at some levels of American society, right? So, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit before, just in personal conversations, but there was the Tuskegee Institute. They have used, unfortunately, a large number of African-American males during the middle of the 20th century. So most famous study that they did was the Tuskegee syphilis study. There's also the issue of just science, for lack of a better term, has kind of a paternalistic attitude towards their test subjects. We're trying to have a better approach to that through scientific ethics and education. For example, you no longer call individuals who participate in science as test subjects in your scientific protocols that you're going to submit to your ethics committee. You have to call them participants, or you have to call them individuals. But a lot of scientists still, how do I say this appropriately? and by appropriately, I don't mean not offensively. I'm just trying not to
Just say it
this the
unfiltered.
wrong way and say the wrong thing. Well, no, it's important to say this right, because if I say this wrong, then it's gonna communicate the wrong idea. In a scientific study, you are obligated to record as many potential outcomes experienced by those participating in the study, whether or not they relate to the study at all. So if you're studying the treatment effect of some drug, and you have a participant that dies during the course of the study, even if they die in a manner that is totally unconnected to the study itself. So you're studying the effects of Tylenol on the common cold, and someone dies in a car accident. You're still obligated to review that, and you're essentially doing a post-mortem analysis. And in some ways, that process, in order to engage in that process appropriately, you almost have to dissociate yourselves from that patient, and you're approaching from the standpoint of, I am responsible for this person, and this person did not have agency. Right? So you're coming at it from the idea that I was in control of this person while they were in my study. I am in charge. I am the authority in their life, right? And anything that happens, I am responsible for. Point of view or attitude, I think, can get out of hand in some scientists, and it leads to a superiority complex, kind of like you were saying, David. Because we are controlling so many variables in our study, we feel like we also have a right to control individuals if we're not careful.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we've been talking about is this idea of trust in science. And of course, one of the purposes of this podcast is to try and give actionable items that people can take for themselves to improve their health. And so it is time for that moment, 1 minute for 1%. And today we're going to have our friend, Dr. Ben Carter, give us the 1 minute for 1%.
All right, so your life is an experiment, and you're always going to be doing things to try and figure out how to live a healthier life. You may be listening to this podcast, you may be reading news articles on the latest dietary trends and fads. As you're engaging in those experiments to try and improve your health, take the time to take some basic health measurements. So a simple way to do that, for example, is to just measure your heart rate. You don't even have to go buy a scale to measure your heart rate. Just pull your phone out and use a timer and feel your pulse and measure your resting heart rate. Do that on a regular basis, and then as you try and change certain aspects of your health to become healthier, like engage in exercise or change your diet, continue to monitor your heart rate. And if that heart rate becomes healthier as you engage in that new diet or that new exercise, then that's a quick and easy and cheap method to tell whether or not that diet and exercise is actually making a difference in your life.
Thank you, Ben. I like that. I think it's simple, and that at its core is what science is about. Is generating evidence and then interpreting that evidence and taking the next step and learning from it and moving forward. So you're saying everyone is under the obligation to kind of be their own citizen scientist, regardless of what your training is, regardless of what your knowledge or expertise is. Generate evidence and learn from it and move forward.
You don't need a good degree. You don't need any specialized
science is a
training.
process.
That's a great way to start, I guess, trusting the scientific method in your own life.